The train rattled steadily down the tracks, its rhythmic clatter filling the air. Calla sat near the window in a quiet corner, her stomach growling angrily. The countryside outside blurred past, fields of green, rolling hills, and the occasional cluster of houses. Her thoughts drifted to the bakery she'd passed in town, its scent of fresh bread tormenting her as she hurried to catch the train. She had been running late, and now the pangs of missed meals gnawed at her relentlessly. She clutched her midsection and sighed, looking around the train car for distraction. It was a lively, bustling space. A businessman with a sleek laptop furiously typed at a table nearby, the glow of the screen reflecting off his glasses. Across the aisle, a young mother tried to calm her wailing toddler while holding a bottle. Behind him, a group of teenagers laughed uproariously, sharing videos on their phones, each person absorbed in their own little world, unaware of Calla's growing hunger or the strange ideas that began to bloom in her mind. It started as a joke, whispered by the primal part of her brain. What if you ate them all? The thought was absurd, but her hunger amplified it. Her stomach growled louder, and the primal whisper became a roar. Her gaze lingered on the businessman first. He seemed so meticulous, every motion deliberate. What would he taste like? She wondered. Something savory, perhaps spicy and bold, like the confidence in his keystrokes. Her tongue flicked over her lips as she shifted her attention to the toddler. Soft and plump, likely sweet. A dessert, maybe. Calla shook her head, horrified by the vividness of her imagination. Get a grip, she muttered under her breath, but the thought lingered, gnawing at the edges of her mind like a persistent itch. Calla shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her stomach twisting and turning as if it were a living thing, desperate to be fed. The hunger was no longer just a physical sensation. It was a force, a presence, consuming her from the inside out. She glanced out the window, hoping the rolling countryside would distract her. The field stretched endlessly, broken only by the occasional barn or grazing animal. Yet, instead of easing her thoughts, the scenery only deepened her longing. Her hunger sharpened her senses to an almost unbearable degree. She could hear the rustle of wrappers as a passenger unwrapped a snack several rows behind her, the faint squeak of the conductor's boots as he walked between cars. The air seemed saturated with the scent of the other passengers. She could smell their perfumes, their body heat, the faint hint of the food they had consumed earlier. It was overwhelming, intoxicating, and maddening all at once. She closed her eyes, but the darkness only amplified her imagination. Her thoughts turned vivid, detailed, and wild. What would each of them taste like? The idea was ludicrous, absurd, and yet it was also irresistible. The businessman at the table nearby was her first focus. She studied him, her gaze lingering. His fingers danced over his laptop keyboard, the faint clack of the keys in perfect rhythm with the train's wheels. He seemed self-assured, meticulous, and efficient. She imagined those qualities translating to a flavor, bold, spicy, and perfectly seasoned. The elderly woman, knitting in her seat, seemed warm and comforting. Her scent reminded Calla of apple pie fresh from the oven, a combination of cinnamon, sugar, and butter. Calla's mouth watered at the thought, her stomach growling audibly. The young mother and her toddler were next. Calla's gaze softened as she watched the woman cradle her child, the two of them a picture of tenderness. The toddler giggled, his chubby fingers grasping for the bottle his mother held. Calla imagined the child as a dessert, something sweet and bubbly, like a fizzy soda or a piece of candy that burst with flavor. The teenagers at the back of the car were louder, their laughter cutting through the din. They were vibrant, full of life, and Calla couldn't help but think of them as something akin to sparkling water or effervescent champagne. light, fizzy, and bursting with energy. The more she thought, the more her hunger grew. It wasn't just her stomach anymore. It was in her chest, her head, her very soul. It whispered to her, teasing her, daring her to act. Why not take just one? The voice in her mind suggested. Just one little taste. They won't even notice. She clenched her fists, digging her nails into her palms, desperate to resist. But the voice wouldn't stop. Calla looked around the car again. The passengers were absorbed in their own lives, unaware of the storm brewing inside her. The businessman didn't even glance up from his laptop, too focused on whatever deal or report he was working on. The elderly woman hummed softly as her needles clicked together. The mother and her child were locked in their own little world, and the teenagers were too busy laughing at their phones to notice her. No one would see. No one would know. Her stomach growled louder, a deep, resonant sound that seemed to echo in the quiet spaces between the train's rattling wheels. Calla's breath quickened. She shifted in her seat, her fingers gripping the armrest tightly. Her nails dug into the fabric, leaving tiny punctures as she tried to control herself. But control was slipping. Her body felt different, more alive, more powerful. She couldn't explain it, but there was an energy coursing through her veins, a primal instinct that refused to be ignored. Her senses were sharper, her reflexes quicker. Even her mouth felt strange, as if her jaw could stretch wider than it should. Her gaze settled back on the businessman. He was the closest, the easiest target. His scent was tantalizing, a mix of aftershave, coffee, and the faint musk of someone who had been working hard all day. Her stomach growled again, this time so loudly that the businessman paused his typing and glanced around, startled. Calla froze, her cheeks flushing. "Are you all right?" he asked, his tone polite but distracted. Calla opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. Instead, a wave of hunger surged through her, overwhelming every other thought or emotion. Her body moved on its own. She stood, her legs shaky but determined, and took a step toward him. The businessman looked up from his laptop, startled by the sudden presence of Calla standing beside him. He adjusted his glasses, his brow furrowing in polite confusion. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice tinged with mild irritation. Calla didn't answer. She stared at him, her breathing shallow, her hands trembling at her sides. The hunger was unbearable now, a roaring fire that consumed her thoughts. Her vision seemed to blur and sharpen at the same time, focusing entirely on the man in front of her. "Miss," he said again, leaning back slightly, his unease growing. And then it happened. Calla opened her mouth. It wasn't a normal gesture. It stretched impossibly wide, her jaw unhinging like a snake's. The businessman's eyes widened in horror as he stumbled backward, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. But it was too late. In one fluid motion, Calla lunged forward and engulfed him whole. There was no chewing, no resistance. The man's body folded and compressed as if by magic, sliding down her throat in a single, seamless gulp. Calla's neck swelled briefly as he passed through, and then her belly ballooned outward, expanding rapidly to accommodate her meal. She staggered backward, gasping for air, her hands flying to her now rounded stomach. It was firm and heavy beneath her fingers, stretching the fabric of her dress to its limits. She could feel the weight of the man inside her, the warmth of him settling in her core. For a moment, she was horrified. She stumbled back into her seat, her mind racing. "What have I done?" she thought. But then the flavor hit her, and everything else melted away. He was incredible, rich and bold. His essence exploded on her tongue like a perfectly seasoned meal. There were hints of spice, a subtle smokiness, and an undertone of sharp bitterness that made her crave more. The taste lingered, coating her mouth and warming her from the inside out. She let out a soft moan, her eyes fluttering closed as she savored the sensation. The hunger, which had tormented her for hours, seemed to fade. Her body relaxed, her muscles unwinding as a deep sense of satisfaction settled over her. Calla opened her eyes, her gaze drifting down to her swollen stomach. It was massive, round and taut, and it shifted slightly as if its contents were rearranging themselves. She placed both hands on it, marveling at the size and weight. "I can't believe I just did that," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the train. But even as she said it, she felt a strange sense of calm. It wasn't guilt or regret that filled her. It was relief. She felt whole, complete, in a way she hadn't in years. The train continued its journey, the rhythmic clatter of the wheels unchanged. No one seemed to notice what had happened. The other passengers were still absorbed in their own lives, unaware that one of their own had disappeared. Calla glanced around, half expecting someone to scream or point at her, but no one even looked her way. The elderly woman was still knitting. The young mother was busy with her child, and the teenagers were lost in their phones. She let out a shaky breath, her hands still resting on her belly. The businessman's laptop and briefcase sat abandoned on the table, the only evidence of his existence. Calla nudged him under the seat with her foot, her heart pounding. She didn't understand what had just happened or how it was even possible. All she knew was that the hunger had driven her to act, and now, for the first time all day, she felt satisfied. Or at least, she thought she did. As the minutes passed, Calla's initial satisfaction began to wane. The warmth in her belly started to fade, and the fire of hunger rekindled. It wasn't as strong as before, but it was there, a subtle gnawing at the edges of her mind. She looked around the train car again, her gaze lingering on the elderly woman. The scent of apples and cinnamon wafted toward her, stronger now, more tantalizing. Calla licked her lips, her fingers curling against the seat. One hadn't been enough. Her stomach growled softly, and she realized with growing certainty that it wouldn't be enough until she had consumed them all. The train car rattled along, oblivious to the storm brewing within its walls. Calla sat back, her swollen stomach a heavy, living presence in her lap. She rubbed it absently, her fingers tracing its taut surface. The sensation was strange. Her body had stretched impossibly to contain the businessman, but there was no pain. Instead, there was a sense of fullness, a deep satisfaction that hummed through her veins. And yet, even as she savored the feeling, the hunger began to return. It was softer this time, less urgent, but no less demanding. Her eyes roamed the car, drawn to the other passengers like a predator sizing up its prey. Her senses, heightened by her first taste, painted each person in vivid detail. Her gaze settled on the elderly woman, still knitting with serene focus. The soft clinking of her needles was soothing, a rhythm that drew Calla in. The woman's scent was warm and inviting, like baked apples and spiced cider. Calla imagined the flavor, her mouth watering at the thought. She stood slowly, her movements deliberate, and waddled toward the woman. Her stomach swayed heavily with each step, brushing against the edges of the aisle. "Excuse me, ma'am," Calla said, her voice soft and polite. The woman looked up, startled but kind. Her eyes crinkled at the corners as she smiled. "Yes, dear." Calla hesitated for a moment, a flicker of guilt piercing through her hunger. The woman reminded her of her grandmother, gentle, comforting, and full of stories. But the hunger was relentless, an insistent pull that drowned out everything else. "I just wanted to tell you," Calla began, her voice trembling slightly, "that your knitting is beautiful." The woman beamed. "Oh, thank you, dear. It's for my granddaughter. She's expecting a little one soon." Calla's heart ached briefly at the thought, but it was too late to stop. The hunger surged forward, and her body acted on instinct. Before the woman could say another word, Calla opened her mouth wide and consumed her whole. The knitting needles clattered to the floor, a faint echo in the now empty seat. The flavor was everything Calla had imagined and more. The woman tasted like warmth, nostalgia, and home, a perfect blend of spiced apples, cinnamon, and buttery crust. Calla closed her eyes, savoring the taste as it spread through her. Her stomach swelled again, larger this time, pressing against the seams of her dress. She staggered slightly, adjusting to the new weight, and sank back into a nearby seat. Her hands cradled her massive belly, which shifted subtly as if its contents were rearranging. She breathed deeply, her heart pounding, and let out a small sigh of satisfaction. But the satisfaction was fleeting. The hunger, insidious and unrelenting, clawed its way back into her mind. Calla's gaze drifted to the young mother and her toddler. The mother was rocking her child gently, humming a soft lullaby. The boy giggled, reaching for the bottle she held. It was a tender scene, one that should have touched Calla's heart. Instead, it only made her hunger stronger. She approached them carefully, her steps slow and measured. The mother looked up, startled by the sight of Calla's enormous belly. "Oh, my goodness, are you all right?" the woman asked, her voice filled with concern. Calla forced a smile. "I'm fine," she said, her voice deceptively calm. "Your little one is adorable. How old is he?" 18 months, the mother replied, her expression softening. "He's a handful, but such a joy." Calla nodded, her hunger roaring in her ears. "He looks sweet." The woman chuckled. "He's sweeter than candy sometimes." Calla didn't wait any longer. She acted swiftly, her mouth stretching impossibly wide. The mother and child disappeared together, their laughter and lullabies replaced by silence. The child was like fizzy candy, bright and effervescent, while the mother was rich and nurturing, like a hearty stew. The flavors mingled on Calla's tongue, each bite more satisfying than the last. Her belly swelled to an even more enormous size, pressing uncomfortably against the train seats. She had to hold it now, cradling it with both hands to keep it from dragging on the floor. At the back of the car, the teenagers were still absorbed in their phones, laughing and chatting loudly. They hadn't noticed a thing. Calla waddled toward them, her movements slow and deliberate. Her swollen stomach brushed against the edges of the aisle, the weight of it making her breathless. One of the teenagers glanced up, his laughter faltering as he took in the sight of her. "Whoa," he said, nudging his friend. "You okay, lady?" Calla smiled, her face serene despite the chaos brewing within her. "I'm fine," she said softly. The teenager opened his mouth to say more, but Calla didn't give him a chance. One by one, she consumed them all, their laughter and energy fading into the depths of her belly. By the time Calla finished, the train car was silent. Every passenger was gone, their essence swirling inside her. She sat down heavily, her massive belly spilling into her lap. She rubbed it gently, feeling the weight of her feast. For the first time in hours, the hunger was gone. In its place was a profound satisfaction, a sense of completeness she hadn't felt in years. She leaned back, her eyes fluttering closed, and let out a deep, contented sigh. The train slowed as it pulled into the station. Calla struggled to her feet, her swollen stomach swaying heavily. It sloshed with every step, the motion making her pause to steady herself. She gritted her teeth and shuffled toward the door, holding her belly to keep it from dragging on the ground. The train conductor stood on the platform, waiting to assist passengers. His cheerful demeanor faltered when he saw Calla. "Miss, are you all right?" he asked, his eyes darting to her enormous stomach. "You look, full," Calla offered with a sly smile. She stepped closer, her belly brushing against the platform's edge. "Well, yes." The conductor stammered, "Are you sure you don't need?" Before he could finish, Calla opened her mouth wide and swallowed him whole. He disappeared without a sound, her stomach stretching even farther to accommodate him. She patted her belly, now impossibly large, and turned toward the exit. "Thanks for the ride," she said sweetly, her voice carrying over the quiet platform. And with that, she waddled off into the distance, her shadow stretching long under the setting sun.